Welcome to the History Nerds Not podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have author Rebecca Bratspies and her book, Naming Gotham. One of those books you think, oh, you can't do more than a Wikipedia entry. It's explaining all of the people who have their names on stuff all around New York City. She made a believer out of me. The book's fantastic. Has a whole bunch of things I knew nothing about. All of these different people. Spoiler alert, a lot of them sucked. But there are some heroes in there. Rebecca has so many interesting facts, even if you're not from New York City, and even if you don't know all these names, this was still a really, really fun conversation. So how about I shut up? Let's talk to Rebecca. And here we are with author Rebecca Bratspies, Naming Gotham, the villains, rogues, and heroes behind New York's place names. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
How did you get this idea? Honestly, right off the bat, you're kind of like, oh, this is cool. You know, this might be Wikipedia worthy. But you somehow turned this into a book that's just, it's packed. Like, this is not a light book. It's packed with facts that even growing up right outside New York City, I did not know. Where did you get the idea? And then when did you say, I can do a book about this?
Well, to be honest, I got the idea because I used to always get stuck in traffic. My parents live in Pennsylvania, and there's no public transit between where I live in Queens and where they live. And the only way to get there is to drive. And that means getting out of New York City, which means crossing a bridge. And I would take the Major Deegan Expressway and be stuck in traffic and be cursing because I don't behave well in traffic. And I would always say, who was this guy? I hate him. Who was this damn Major Deegan? No one ever knew, because nobody had a clue who Major Deegan was. He just was the highway. And my family got a little sick of hearing me say this over and over and over again. So finally they just said, well, why don't you find out? So I did. And it turned out that he was not nearly as interesting or as impressive as you might expect, given that he has the road that runs by Yankee Stadium and connects to the George Washington Bridge, named after him. So, that sort of got me interested. And I was like, well, who was Van Wyck? Who was Kosciuszko? Who was Sheridan? Who was Bruckner? Who were all of these people that we name our roads and bridges and other infrastructure after? And so it sort of became a hobby. And as you said, they're like all these really interesting little tidbits of fact that you can know about them and all this gossip and backstory. And so I became that person who's always like, well, did you know? And then fill in the blank with, some factoid. And it turns out that that's not really the best way to engage with people. They're like, yeah, I don't want to hear that anymore, thanks. And people started telling me, you should write a book. So I did.
Honestly, it's exactly how the podcast, the blog started, was I had all of these tidbits and nobody wanted to hear it. So now I just assault people through the internet and through their ears. It's fine. I think it works. Now, I want to jump ahead just a little bit because you've already brought it up. A, I don't trust people who don't curse in traffic. I feel like they're hiding something. But B, if you had to guess, whose name is used in vain the most in New York City? Who do you think it is?
Oh, that is quite a competition. We could have brackets and do a...
I mean, this might be the hardest question I've ever asked on the podcast. It is up there.
I mean, for me, it's Major Deegan because I would have to get to the George Washington Bridge. But I would imagine that Clifford Holland, for whom the Holland Tunnel is named after, is damned quite a bit. Anybody going to JFK to catch a flight, I'm sure hates Van Wyck or Van Wyck, depending on which pronunciation you want to use. There are so many people to hate. The Kosciuszko Bridge is a nightmare. The Pulaski Bridge isn't super fun. If you're trying to go through Staten Island, Outer Bridge is really not somebody you're overly fond of. And one thing as a New Yorker, you may or may not know, the Outer Bridge crossing is named after a guy named Eugenius Outerbridge. And it's called the Outer Bridge Crossing because they couldn't call it Outer Bridge Bridge. That would sort of be silly. But most New Yorkers don't know that. They just think, because it is the outermost bridge, people just think, oh yeah, it's the Outer Bridge.
It's a funny thing. I put up my Goodreads review a month or two ago, and that was one of the comments was, the Outer Bridge, is that named after somebody? I said, don't worry, Rebecca gets right into it in the book. It's right up front. She doesn't make you wait for it. So it was very hard planning for what I was going to ask you because you have all these different vignettes, and I should say all of these people are interesting. But were you surprised at how many people were just plain awful? There's a lot of awful people in this book.
There are a lot of awful people in this book. Yes and no. The thing about naming, think about now, right? People buy naming rights. Think about colleges and, the people who are buying the naming rights are the robber barons. They're the people who are vilified for their lack of social consciousness and their lack of care about other people. But damn it, they put their name on something. And, what we're talking about is an era where people didn't buy naming rights. They were honored with a name. But it was the same set of people who were being honored, with some exceptions like Major Deegan, people who were, just sort of well-connected and not actually that impressive or interesting. But it didn't really surprise me. If you think about who gets to decide what counts as history and who gets to decide whose lives matter, it's not surprising that a lot of the people that things are named after are not sort of moral exemplars, but are crooks or are robber barons or are scamsters or, a lot of them in New York and everywhere else were enslavers. They held people in slavery and made a lot of money off of stolen labor. That's changing, right? We're starting to see some renaming. We're starting to see a little more recognition of that. We're starting to see a wider panoply of people who are considered to be exemplars to name things after. Long answer, but it didn't really surprise me that much.
What I found very interesting, and you can probably give some examples of this, is some of these guys did suck. There's no other way to say it. But at the same time, they were also so integral in creating what we know as New York City nowadays. Which means it's one thing to hand wave something away because, somebody was friends with him, they made him a statue. It's another thing where this guy is a robber baron and there's a lot of things we don't like about him, but he also made sure he was an architect that made sure these things that are so indelibly New York. Anybody jump to your mind when you talk about that, where they might not have the best humanitarian side of them, but as far as architecture, it's hard to divorce them from New York.
Yeah, well, there's this cohort of white men that I call bureaucrats with roads. There are people like Major Deegan and Henry Bruckner and Arthur Sheridan who were instrumental in building the New York that we know in some fashion or other. And that's why they have a road named after them. They were not terribly impressive people in and of themselves. Henry Bruckner, for example, was before he became the Bronx president, right? The boroughs of New York, for listeners who don't know this, New York is made up of 5 boroughs, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island, and each one has a president. So Henry Bruckner was the president of the Bronx, and it's sort of a mostly ceremonial position, but you get an official expense account. And he was, before he became the Bronx president, he had a soda company, and this was during Prohibition. And so he made a fortune selling soft drinks when people couldn't buy hard drinks that had alcohol in them. And then he went into politics, and he was a congressional representative where he missed well over 50% of the votes. He was almost never there. And then he became Bronx Borough president, where he promptly got swept up in massive corruption scandals. So why is something named after him? It's a really good question. He was Robert Moses adjacent, and Robert Moses built almost all the roads and bridges and parks that we have in the city. And he was apparently very well liked, despite being a crook.
Now, you mentioned him. This is somebody I've known about since I was younger because I heard these stories. People not in the area, I grew up in the suburbs just outside New York City, and one of the roads you're probably going to take up there is the Palisades Interstate Parkway, Palisades. And I remember growing up, I was told about Robert Moses and how he built all these roads and how certain roads, especially going upstate or to some of the nicer areas, the bridges were built lower. And when people started looking into that, could you tell me why Robert Moses built some low-level bridges?
Yeah, he was a son of a bitch. He believed in creating facts, and I'm using air quotes as I say that. So Robert Moses was very interested in making sure that white New Yorkers had nice roads to drive on, and this was the time when the suburbs were being developed. And he wanted to make sure that people who lived in the suburbs could get into New York City and back again in a convenient fashion so that they could commute to work. But what he didn't want was the low-life scum of New York City, meaning those of like regular people who took buses because we didn't have cars in the 1940s and 50s. He didn't want us to be able to go to those communities. This is true for the roads that lead to the beaches as well. He didn't want people who had to take buses polluting his beautiful, pristine, lily white communities. That was particularly targeted at Blacks and Jews, but not exclusively. It was really targeted at the working class sort of writ large.
To me, he's the arch villain in the book. Can you think of anybody that you dislike more than him?
Oh, yeah. Richard Riker, hands down.
All right, tell me about him.
Yeah, so Rikers Island is named after the Riker family. They were a Dutch family. They were the von Riken family. But when the British took over from the Dutch, they anglicized their name because they were very go-with-the-flow kind of people. They were a family that held a lot of land here in New York. And in fact, the last patent, right, the last land grant that Peter Stuyvesant gave as Director General of New Netherlands was the patent for Rikers Island to the von Riken family, though it became Rikers Island because they became the Rikers. And so Richard Riker was like 3 generations in. So it's after the Revolution. And it's in the early run up to the Civil War. He first becomes the DA of Manhattan, and then he becomes the recorder, which was like a municipal judge. So as recorder, one of his jobs was to sign manumission certificates when people were freeing people who were enslaved. And New York had ended slavery, so people were being manumitted, freed. So he signed those, and he knew there were lots of Black New Yorkers who were free people. Another one of his jobs was to enforce the Fugitive Slave Acts, which were acts that were passed in the federal government requiring states that had outlawed slavery to cooperate with southern states trying to capture people who had liberated themselves from slavery and were fleeing north or to Canada. Richard Riker had that job as well. And he was not only perfectly willing to do that work, but he, along with the police chief and a couple other high-ranking officials, created what came to be known as the Kidnapping Club, which was a scheme to grab random Black New Yorkers off the street, say they were fugitive slaves, deny them the right of habeas corpus to prove that they were in fact free people, and send them into slavery. I just can't imagine anything more villainous than that.
It's pretty bad, and luckily karma does sometimes work because now an absolute hellhole of a prison really has his name more than anything else, because Rikers prison, you just call it Rikers, that's all it is. Now, I don't want to go full negative the whole time, because we do have some heroes here. It's too easy. Jackie Robinson jumps right out. If you have a problem with Jackie Robinson,
exactly,
please see somebody. Who else did you learn about here and you're like, hey, this is somebody that I'm really glad something is named after them?
Can I tell you 2 people?
Please.
First, Thaddeus Kosciuszko. There's a bridge named after him that connects Queens and Brooklyn, the Kosciuszko Bridge. And he was a general in the Revolutionary War. He was a Polish-trained military officer who came to the United States to fight for freedom, as he said when he walked into Benjamin Franklin's print shop in Philadelphia. He said, I'm here to fight for freedom. I'm here to fight for the revolution. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson called him the purest son of liberty I have ever met. Well, he really was. He was an ardent anti-slavery advocate during the Revolutionary War in the 1770s and 1780s. He was a passionate anti-slavery advocate. His aide-de-camp was a Black man, a free Black man from Massachusetts who had enlisted, a guy named Agrippa Hull. And they together formed this incredible working relationship that really helped the Continental Army win the war. After the Revolutionary War was over, Kosciuszko went back to Poland, where he was from originally, where he led an uprising, a revolution there. And it was successful for a little while. They kicked out the Russian puppet government and formed a genuine Polish government, at which point he ended serfdom and guaranteed religious freedom to all peoples in Poland. It didn't last long, unfortunately. He was wounded in battle and the uprising eventually failed. He came back to the United States to recover from his war wounds in Philadelphia. He was greeted like a hero, and he recovered in a house in Philadelphia that is now a not national park, it's a national monument, a national special site. Anyway, you can go there and you can see the house. It's pretty cool. Where he was host to, among other people, Chief Little Turtle of the Miami tribe. In the book, I have his Chief Little Turtle's actual name. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to butcher it trying. But reputedly, when he met with Chief Little Turtle, he Kosciuszko, gave Chief Little Turtle the dueling pistols that he had been awarded as a military cadet in Poland at the Polish military school and said, use these on the first person who comes to subjugate you. He was truly a revolutionary. His values were in the right place. And in his will, he left all of his property in the United States to be used to purchase the freedom of Black men and to get them started in a trade.
Now, I had heard about him, so if you're in the New York area, there was a statue of him on West Point as well, which is where I learned about him.
Oh, yeah, he helped design West Point.
Yes, I believe, and I hope I'm not getting it right, I believe The Rebel Prince is an excellent biography of his that I read years ago. It's nice to have those types of people you can look back and say, like, yeah, I can sign off on all of this. Not to mention the, I'm sure, apocryphal story that he had his heart taken out when he was buried. Because he did not want his heart buried someplace that wasn't free, which was Poland where he was, and had a heart shipped to Sweden until Poland became free again.
Yeah, I think that's probably apocryphal.
Oh, totally made up.
He was captured in battle by the Russian forces, and they let him go on the condition that he never go back to Poland. So after he left the United States, he first went to France, where Napoleon was like trying to really get him to sign on to the Napoleonic cause because he was this major revolutionary, and Napoleon clearly saw the advantages of having Kosciuszko's aura spread over him. But Kosciuszko thought that Napoleon was going to be a dictator and didn't sign on. He went to Switzerland where he died. So he may have wanted his heart to be buried in Poland once it was free, but he did die in Switzerland.
It's still a great story. So
it is.
Listen, nerds, if you're listening, you want to retell that story, it's probably not true, but you can go ahead. It's fine. We'll let
but
that
it's a
happen.
good story.
All right, who's your number 2?
Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress. She was elected from Brooklyn in 1968 after the Voting Rights Act required that New York, among other places, be redistricted to prevent the sort of dilution of Black voting power, which had happened all across the country. She ran against the will of the Democratic Party because they wanted James Farmer to be candidate and be elected. James Farmer was a former freedom rider. He was a big guy. He was very macho and swaggering and quite impressive. So they wanted him to be the person that they were sending to Washington. And she was this tiny little woman with a slight accent because she had grown up in the Caribbean. She was an American citizen, but her family was from there. And during the Depression, they had sent her back because the family was struggling. So her campaign was that she was unbought and unbossed because the powers that be didn't want her to run. And when she ran, she immediately started shaking things up. So she walked into Congress and immediately started making her voice heard. And she wound up creating the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children program for food benefits. And she also helped she partnered with Robert Dole to create the food stamp program. She was instrumental in getting Title IX passed, which is the law that prevents discrimination against women in universities and in sports. And just all around was super, super impressive.
What I really appreciated about your book, we just talked about some people are heroes, some people are villains. You really wanted to get the history right and the full perspective of these people, because for each of these people that you talked about, you did not shy away from, hey, he may be a villain, but he did do some good things over here. And the opposite that, this person may have been really good, but there were some things that they got caught up in. Because a lot of these people were kind of half and half, right? Where they've done wonderful things, but also there was a scandal or two here or there. What person was the hardest one for you to research that there wasn't a lot to go on and you had to really, really dig to get information on?
Lula Lasker. Central Park has 2 ice skating rinks. It has in the southern end of the park is the Woolman rink, and the northern end of the park was the Lasker rink. They're rebuilding it now, and I don't know if it will have her name when it's done. But it was named after her. She was super interesting, but she left very little footprint in the historical record. She was Jewish. She was a Southerner. And she moved to New York. Basically, she grew up in Texas. And as far as I can tell, the moment she could, she got the hell out of there and came north. She went to Vassar college and then came to New York City, where she was a prominent socialist writer. She was deeply involved in housing. She was an advocate for affordable housing. She was an advocate against racial discrimination in housing. Again, we're talking the 1930s, 1940s, into the 1950s. She also was the editor of a magazine called Survey, which was a magazine about architecture and art. And I think she was gay. I don't know that for sure. But all the sort of signs of her life was that she was a gay woman living in New York. There's the tipping point between honorific naming and paying for naming. In her will, she left money to help complete the ice skating rink at the northern end of Central Park at like 110th Street. And that was the rink that ultimately wound up being named after her as the Lula Lasker rink. It also was the first rink, interestingly, that was a pool in the summer and an ice skating rink in the winter. Designed by Robert Moses.
His name keeps coming up, unfortunately. All right, let's do a couple what-ifs. Mm-hmm. I'm going to let you are in charge of all the boroughs. I let you rename one thing. Which one are you pulling the name down off of?
Oh, Rikers Island, no question about it.
I feel like it almost fits, though, with the prison and everything.
Well, the jail will be closed in 2027.
Okay.
That is under local law. And afterwards, there's a plan here in New York City called Renewable Rikers. And it is embodied in 3 local laws that collectively are known as Renewable Rikers. The plan is to turn it into renewable energy generation and storage and a modern wastewater treatment facility in order to take polluting infrastructure, meaning like, polluting power plants and old, dirty wastewater treatment plants out of the communities that were most impacted by over-policing and mass incarceration on Rikers Island, most of which are predominantly Black communities, which brings us back to this parallel of Riker being a name that was like a terror in the Black community in the 1800s and now. So I feel like that needs to be named. And in fact, the law says there's going to be a sort of a planning process about renaming it. I don't know what the name will be, but that is, just saying the name like makes you feel bad.
I vote for Island McIsland Face. I think that should be the new name for it.
Yeah, it's not going to be that kind of a voting because that's what we would wind up with.
All right, next thing. I let you somehow magically talk to one person from your book so you can interview them. Who's it going to be?
That is hard because there's so many I would love to talk to.
You can also interview one to punch them in the face if you like. You can talk to them or you can punch them. Which one are you going with?
I might want to talk to Gertrude Whitney. She was just a fascinating character. She was an artist. She's the founder of the Whitney Museum. She was the granddaughter of Commodore Vanderbilt, right? The one who was richer than God. And she was the eldest child of his eldest son. So she had money coming out of her ears. She had a very unhappy childhood. She didn't fit in. She wanted to be a boy like her brothers. She cut her hair short because as far as she could tell, that was the only thing that was different between her and her brothers. And she thought maybe she'd be treated better. And she wanted to be an artist. And she really was a very serious artist. She designed some of the friezes on the arch in Washington Square Park, the Victory Arch. There's a statue up in, I don't even know what part of New York that is, really far north, Manhattan, right around where Columbia Presbyterian is, that she designed. That's a World War I memorial. Her most famous thing that she designed is the Titanic Memorial, which is a young, probably man person standing with their back arched and their arms out, like that famous shot from the movie Titanic. And in fact, that shot was inspired by her artwork. She was just really interesting. And she lived this sort of uptown, downtown life. She had this really wealthy Playboy husband, and they lived the life of the 1% of the era. But she also had studios down in McDougal Street, which was a sort of scruffy part of town, where she lived a very bohemian life. She hung out with all kinds of young and promising artists. She really pushed American art. She supported a lot of people. And I think she would be fascinating to talk to.
Now, I want to come full circle. Who was Major Deegan? And does he deserve to have his name cursed by you so often?
I sort of have a soft spot for Major Deegan. He actually was a major in the Army during World War I. He was officially part of the American Expeditionary Force. And I say officially in the sense that he never was part of any expeditions. He stayed here in New York. He worked as part of the Army Corps of Engineers, actually under the supervision of General George Washington Goethals, who the Goethals Bridge is named after. And in that capacity, he designed fortifications around New York in case the Germans attacked, which obviously they didn't do, though there were some sightings of submarines and stuff. And after the war, he did a couple of things. He was a trained architect, so he actually was quite qualified to do that work, but he wound up being the tenement commissioner here in New York City. And this was the 1930s. There was massive movement of people around the globe, people flooding into New York. The population of New York was doubling every decade. And the housing stock was completely inadequate. It was dangerous. It was fire-ridden. And the New York legislature passed what became known as the tenement codes, which were laws that had basic minimum standards for housing. Things like there has to be a staircase. You can't just have a ladder between floors. There has to be 2 means of egress for a room. So every bedroom has to have a window that actually faces the outside so somebody could get out in an emergency, as well as a door. There have to be locks on doors. There have to be lights in hallways. The things that we consider today to be the absolute minimums of habitable domiciles will come to us from the tenement code. And as tenement commissioner, it was Major Deegan's job to enforce those tenement codes. And he took it pretty seriously. He was best buddies with New York's very corrupt mayor, Jimmy Walker at the time, but he seemed to take his job seriously, and he sent out inspectors and he was enforcing the law, and he made a point of enforcing the law for Black residents as well as white residents. And he was very clear about that. He helped found the Foreign Legion, one of the other important things that he did, and was a big advocate for veterans returning and for better health care for veterans, something that we're still struggling with today. My favorite thing about him was that he declared war on pigeons. He was convinced that pigeons spread polio, which they don't. But he also knew that pigeon coops on rooftops were a fire hazard, which they were. So he banned pigeon coops on rooftops. And there were a lot of pigeon fanciers in New York at the time. There were thousands of people who kept pigeons. And
not anymore.
No, there's still some, but they're not like there were. And they were outraged. And some of them were like, we're going to renounce our American citizenships if you allow this outrage to move forward. I don't think any of them actually renounced their American citizenship. They petitioned him. They pleaded with him saying, but we need these pigeons for war readiness. You're a major. And he was like, you know what? This is the 20th century. We don't actually do that anymore. He did, however, generously say that pigeons could stay in the parks.
So he does not deserve all the epithets you throw his way. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, he was very much one of the bureaucrats with roads. I mean, if I weren't so interested in meeting Gertrude Whitney, I might pick him just because I think he was really interesting. He had this very fancy Packard car that he had detailed and customized, and he would drive around the city in his Packard. Everybody knew it was his car. And in fact, it was stolen one time, and it was recovered just because it was parked on the side of the street by whoever stole it. And they're like, oh yeah, that's Deegan's car. And they got it back to him because there was only one.
Now, Rebecca, this is obviously doing gangbusters. Everybody loves it. So when are we getting naming Walla Walla? When are we going to get naming Cleveland? Come on, let's start getting these out there.
Yeah, a lot of people have asked me to do their hometown. Or I used to live in Philadelphia, and they're like, oh, do Philadelphia. I really think that this was a labor of love for me, for the city that I have made my home and I love as much as I curse. I would like to see this kind of a book about other cities, but I really do feel like it's something that should be written by somebody who lives there and loves it and is really immersed in the culture of the city. So I don't have any plans at this point of making, as I said to you earlier, sort of chicken soup for New York and for Baltimore and Omaha. And each of those places, though, has really cool names. And one of my hopes is that people reading this book, wherever they are, will sort of look around and say, I wonder who that was, and then find out.
All right, listen, Fargo, she said she didn't have plans for it. She didn't say no. If you send enough emails, maybe we can get her on this.
Fargo is a lovely town. I was there. I worked for a judge on the 8th Circuit, my earliest part of my legal career, and I visited Fargo. It is very interesting.
So you go, there it is again, Fargo. She's opening the door. All right, Rebecca, last question for you. A lot of people will say they don't like history. It's a class they had to take in high school. They don't like it. It's boring, right? If I sat one of those poor misguided souls in front of you and they said, why should I read Naming Gotham? What would you say?
Because this is about who we are or who we think we are, right? The names we give things are a window into how we think history happened. And the people that we name things after are really interesting. As we have said throughout this, some of them maybe were good people. Some of them were really bad people. A lot of them were regular old people like you and I are, but they did something that triggered this kind of an honoring. And they're interesting. And you realize as you read this that people are people and they have been through all time. Looking back, all the way back to the very beginning of this country, there were people of all races and all religions. There were people of all genders. There were people who were intersex. And, as tidbit in the book, you can find out, there were people who were gay and they all lived here and made this city together. And it's really fun and exciting not to say, well, on this date, this thing happened, but to say, wonder what it was like to live a life of a government bureaucrat in the 1930s who's super well connected, even if he's not rich, and has an expense account and a car and goes to Broadway shows all the time. I wonder what it was like to be the poor little rich child of the richest family in the history had ever known. I wonder what it was like to be a soldier who was sort of trying to, fight for freedom. I mean, it's very much about, history is about people. That's what I would say.
The book is fantastic. I loved it. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Rebecca, thanks so much. Naming Gotham, trust me, people, even if you're not a city person, it's still a really good read. Hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.